Welcome to a bonus episode of the Blooms and Barnacles podcast. I'm Kelly.
I'm Dermot.
But I'm supposing you already know that because you're here on our Patreon. Welcome. This is a very exciting episode because this is our final episode in our series on Dubliners. Because The Dead is the last story in Dubliners. But we read that as our very first bonus episode last year. So once we finish this, Dermot, we'll have finished all of Dubliners. And more importantly, you've completed an entire work by James Joyce.
For the first time in my life.
Yeah, after doing this podcast for, 6 years now?
Yeah. The slow and leisurely way. Though I speed and that I cannot miss. So.
That's right. How does it feel?
Fine. Good, yeah. Look, I guess if there's any mystique about Joyce, I'd say anyone who hasn't read Dubliners, it's quite readable. Like you don't need a PhD in quantum mechanics to understand it.
That's usually what you find people say, is that Dubliners is the most accessible. But I think as we've found as we've worked our way through it, there's still quite a bit of meat on that bone. You won't get everything in the first read. So our last story then was the story that Joyce intended to finish the collection initially before The Dead was stuck on the end there. And that is a little story called Grace. Could you give us a quick synopsis of Grace?
Yeah, the story starts with a dynamic opening. I seem to remember, like it's just this guy flat on the ground in a public toilet, and the charitable explanation is he just slipped and fell. But we know it's Dublin, 1904, and we're well familiar with the kind of lifestyles of many of the men in the city at the time, so he's probably pissed. And people come to his aid, and a great lurid description of his face on the ground of the public toilet, which must have been super stinky. Some of those Dublin places, if you haven't been to Dublin, the toilets are downstairs. And, even places I like, but they've grandfathered in like Kennedy's, across the street from Sweeney's. And they've got the downstairs toilets. And so it's kind of a smell trap. That's with modern ventilation. It must have been super rank back in the day. I remember there used to be an underground toilet in Conley Station. And the idea of having my face pressed to the floor of what was down there, probably sealed up and poured on concrete now, but yuck. Just the yuck, acrid, ammonia smell.
All right, so we've got anyway, our man face down in the john.
That's the opening. How did he get there? The mystery of it. Lovely description, too, of all the people coming to help him, and they give him a glass of brandy to strictly for medicinal...
sober him up with some...
Strictly for medicinal purposes, you understand. And, this is the last thing this man needs, but it seems to revive him. Then he has somebody figures out who he is, and they help him into a carriage home. I think the constable, too, is actually fairly humane with him. He could have been arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Then the story follows on to familiar names from Ulysses, Martin Cunningham, who we're familiar with on the Hades section when he's in the carriage to Paddy Digham's funeral. They do what we would regard as an intervention, the closest analogue they have to an intervention in 1904 in Dublin, which is we'll all confess our sins to this fella and try to persuade him to go on a retreat with the Jesuits and hear Mass, and maybe God and Jesus will help him to sober up. And of course, that's doomed. There's no way. There's simply no way that's going to work. But it's a nice thought, and people seem to care for it. Or they wouldn't go to this quite elaborate charade of, sure, I think we've all been drinking a bit hard. I think we all need to cut back a little bit. Don't you think? Oh, I think so too. Absolutely. Don't you think so? What's his face? His name? Tom.
Tom Kernan. Do you remember Tom Kernan from Ulysses?
I remember the name, but he was one of that ocean of people that's kind of hard to pull out of.
He's in Hades as well. Bloom mentions him a couple times as a tea merchant that he wants to, I believe, get some discount tea from.
The Keys? Was that the Keys or somebody? He's not related to the Keys guy, was he?
He's a separate wine, spirit, and tea merchant.
Okay.
Tom Kernan works for I believe it's the Belfast & Co. tea company. I hadn't considered this before, but I think it's telegraphing that he's a Protestant. Yes. Sympathetic, which he definitely is in the story.
I think he was Protestant and he converted to Catholicism to marry.
Yes, it's a big part of his character, and I just hadn't realized that detail of the Belfast Tea Company was meant to telegraph that. But no, in Ulysses, kind of his very small arc in Hades is that he and Bloom are stuck together because Bloom is a converted Jew and Tom Kernan is a converted Protestant. And in both cases, it didn't really take. Yeah. And Tom Kernan is kind of rhapsodizing about, it's so much nicer in the Anglican service, or I can't remember exactly what his words were. But yeah, that carries on from this. Martin Cunningham, do you remember Mr. Jack Power?
Jack Power, I don't recall now.
He's in Hades. He's not a very memorable character. He's sort of the more stern man in the carriage.
Okay.
He's in the carriage with Bloom and Martin Cunningham. Simon Dedalus, who's not in this. And then the other kind of the comic relief is Mr. McCoy. Now, do you remember Mr. McCoy?
Again, the name, but you don't have to...
He shares some characteristics with his Ulysses version, where he's kind of a bum and nobody really likes him, and he has a scam where he borrows people's valises and they never come back, and his wife's like a 2-bit music teacher. He's the one that Bloom ran into for the Stop and Chat and Lotus Eaters and was trying to get away from
now I
him.
remember. And he has the wife who's also a singer, but she's not as good as Molly.
That's
and
right.
Bloom sort of feels a bit superior to him.
And then he blocks Bloom's view of the woman getting onto the jaunting car or whatever it is, or it's a tram that goes by and blocks it, I think. But he blames McCoy.
Right.
He has no desire to talk to McCoy. And then McCoy doesn't go to Patty's funeral.
Right.
I can't remember quite what his grift was, but everyone on the
Because he owed them money.
Yeah, it was something with money, and he didn't want to be around all the Freeman's Journal people.
But he asked him to put his name in.
That's right.
So, yes.
C.P. McCoy, yeah.
Yeah.
So
he's got some defects, let's just say. Character weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What did you think of Grace? Just,
I liked it. Like, I couldn't read any deep meaning into it other than a guy who drinks too much. His wife is long-suffering. I was very sad when his wife, she sees weddings and she just hangs around just to see the happy couple to remind her of what it was like when she was married first.
Yeah.
And how far they've fallen. He's not the worst husband in the world, but it's just he drinks too much.
Yeah. I would say this is the closest of any of the Dubliners stories to sort of a comedic story, because no one's really hurt. Nothing really, really bad happens.
Yeah.
As far as we know. And everybody kind of turns out all right. When I was at the symposium this summer, my favorite fact I learned while I was there is that Joyce was disappointed that more people didn't comment on how funny Ulysses is. I don't know imagine how that could happen. His sense of humor isn't as foregrounded in Portrait and Dubliners as it is in Ulysses. Right. But this story, you start to see him develop his odd erudite comedic voice at the expense of these men who are all based on his father's friends. So I did want to say too up top, the story in my mind is always kind of paired with Ivy Day in the Committee Room, because they're both a little bit on the longer side. They're both kind of ensemble stories, and they're both at the end of the book, basically. But I think when we talked about Ivy Day, I said that it felt like it could be a one-act play. This couldn't be a one act because there's 3 scenes in it, which is important when we start looking at the structure of the story. But this story also felt like a stage play to me. I think you could do 1 scene in the pub, you could do 1 scene Tom Kernan in bed, and then 1 scene at the Jesuit retreat. And I think it would be it would adapt well to the stage. So, any playwrights out there? That's my advice: is adapt this and Ivy Day as little comedic turns for the stage. Have fun with it. See if you can pop those corks safely. We got some background about the inception of Grace. So this comes again from James Joyce's brother Stanislaus, his autobiography of his brother called My Brother's Keeper. According to Stanislaus, Joyce based Grace on what Stanislaus calls an absurd incident that occurred between their father and his friends. And that this is based largely on accounts from Stanislaus' own diaries and letters. Now, Tom Kernan, as we'll see, is based on one of their friends. So, in Stanislaus' telling now of this real-life anecdote, he had followed his father and his friends to the Jesuit church in Gardiner Street there in the north side of Dublin on the last evening of this retreat. Now, in the story, it's kind of condensed down. It could have been a longer retreat, but we just see the one very small scene of it. But the real retreat would have been over multiple nights, multiple days. And Stanislaus says that he kind of snuck behind them like this and snuck into the back of the church to, quote, listen to the sermon and watch my father fumbling shamefacedly with his lighted candle. And that the sermon was a, quote, man-to-man talk in a chatty tone. So it's more or less what's portrayed there. Do you remember Tom Kernan getting very indignant at the notion that he'd have to hold a lighted candle?
Yes. Yeah, it bothered him.
Yes, we're meant to read that in the story and think he's not really Catholic. He said the words and did the ritual, but he's not really Catholic. He doesn't like all that ceremonial stuff.
Yeah.
But that comes from their father, who would have been actually Catholic, but also not really Catholic. but also Catholic, but also not really. You get the idea. Stanislaus then says, too, that his father came home one night with his friend Matthew Kane, who is Martin Cunningham in the story, and told of how the priest in confession at the retreat had said to John Joyce that he, quote, wasn't such a bad fellow after all, which made both of them laugh and weep. That scene didn't make it into the story of Grace. Any thoughts?
No.
Our players here, we've talked about a few of them. Real quick, Martin Cunningham was based on a friend of the Joyce family called Matthew Kane. We've talked a lot about him already in the main show, so if you haven't seen that, I didn't write down the episode number, but I believe it's something like Who Was the Real Patty Dignam. Go listen to that episode if you really want to know about Matthew Kane. But Stanislaus said that he was ignorant but shrewd, and his energy and self-confidence caused him to be regarded by his friends as very reliable and level-headed, a solid man. Tom Kernan was based on a man named Dick Thornton. These are all just friends of the Joyce's father, John Joyce, and he was indeed a Protestant who had converted to Catholicism, and also it kind of didn't take. One telling detail is that Stanislaus said that despite his conversion, he apparently remained a Freemason. Now, why would that be a telltale sign?
Well, Catholics aren't supposed to be Freemasons. Yeah. The ban is more on the Catholic Church saying you're not allowed to join. So he's indirect. People say that Freemasons wouldn't accept Catholics. I'm not sure about that. I think it's more the Catholic Church doesn't want you to be a Mason because it's a secret organization coming out of like the Anglo background. So it's kind of an enemy. But the fact that he's still in it, that he hasn't severed that link, suggests that he's not super serious about being a Catholic.
Yes.